In the amber light of autumn 1885, when the Rocky Mountains painted themselves in shades of gold and crimson, there arrived in Millbrook, Colorado, a woman whose heart carried more scars than most souls could bear. Sarah Mitchell stepped off the dusty train platform with trembling fingers clutching a worn leather satchel, her dark eyes scanning the horizon for a face she'd never seen, but had dreamed about for months. The mountain air was crisp with promises of winter, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell chimed 3 times, marking the hour when dreams either bloom or wither away forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. She had traveled over 1,000 miles from the sooty streets of Boston, leaving behind the charred remains of everything she'd once called home. The scent of smoke still haunted her dreams, and sometimes, in the quiet moments before dawn, she could still hear the screams echoing through the tenement halls, where her family had perished in flames that consumed not just wood and brick, but the very essence of who she used to be. The townspeople back east had whispered that tragedy followed her like a shadow, that she was cursed, broken beyond repair. But Sarah had chosen to believe that distance could heal what time had not, that in the vast openness of the Colorado territory, she might finally breathe without the weight of ashes in her lungs. The correspondence had begun 6 months earlier when Sarah, desperate for a fresh start, had answered an advertisement in the Boston Herald. William Harrison, a prosperous rancher from Millbrook, sought a respectable woman to share his life and help manage his growing cattle operation. His letters had been formal yet kind, speaking of wide-open spaces where a person could start anew, of a life built on honest work and simple pleasures. He had asked few questions about her past, which Sarah had taken as a sign of compassion rather than indifference. She had written back carefully, mentioning the fire that had claimed her family, but not dwelling on the nightmares that followed. The way her hands shook when she heard sudden noises, or how she sometimes woke screaming in the middle of the night. Sarah had spent her last savings on a proper traveling dress made of deep blue wool, with pearl buttons that caught the light like tiny moons. She had learned to style her auburn hair in the fashionable Gibson girl manner, and had practiced walking with the confident grace she imagined a rancher's wife should possess. In her satchel, she carried her mother's Bible, a small silver locket with a photograph of her lost family, and a collection of dried herbs that she had learned to use for healing during her time volunteering at the Boston City Hospital. The work had been her salvation in those dark months after the fire. Tending to the sick and wounded had given her purpose when grief threatened to swallow her whole. The train journey west had been a pilgrimage of hope. Sarah had watched the landscape transform from the familiar brick and smoke of industrial Boston to the rolling farmlands of the Midwest, and finally to the breathtaking majesty of the Rocky Mountains. Each mile had felt like a step away from the woman she had been and toward the woman she might become. She had imagined herself standing in a sunlit kitchen, kneading bread while William read the newspaper aloud, or walking hand in hand through fields of wildflowers, their children playing at their feet. The dreams had sustained her through the sleepless nights in cramped train compartments, and the uncertainty that gnawed at her stomach like hunger. Now as she stood on the platform in Millbrook, Sarah felt the familiar flutter of anxiety in her chest. The town was smaller than she had imagined, a collection of wooden buildings clustered around a main street that seemed to stretch no more than a few city blocks. The mountains loomed overhead like ancient sentinels, their peaks already dusted with early snow. A few curious townspeople glanced in her direction, their eyes taking in her traveling dress and the obvious signs of a journey. She smoothed her skirt and adjusted her hat, trying to project a confidence she did not feel. William Harrison had promised to meet her at the station, but the platform was nearly empty save for a few railroad workers loading cargo and an elderly man with a weathered face who tipped his hat politely as he passed. Sarah checked the small watch pinned to her dress, noting that the train had arrived precisely on time. Perhaps William had been delayed by ranch business, she told herself, trying to quiet the voice in her head that whispered warnings she did not want to hear. As the minutes stretched into an hour, Sarah's confidence began to crumble like autumn leaves. She had positioned herself near the station house where she would be easily visible, her satchel at her feet and her hands folded in her lap. The afternoon sun was warm on her shoulders, but she found herself shivering despite the pleasant weather. A group of children ran past, their laughter echoing off the wooden buildings, and for a moment, Sarah felt a pang of longing so sharp it took her breath away. She had always loved children, had dreamed of having a house full of them, their voices filling the spaces that grief had left empty. Finally, as the shadows began to lengthen and the mountain air grew cooler, Sarah heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. A tall man in a dark coat rode up to the station on a chestnut horse, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. He dismounted with the easy grace of someone who had spent his life in the saddle, and Sarah's heart began to race with anticipation. This must be William, she thought, rising to her feet and smoothing her dress one final time. The man approached slowly, his eyes taking in her appearance with an expression that Sarah could not quite read. He was handsome in a rough-hewn way, with sun-weathered skin and pale blue eyes that seemed to look right through her. When he spoke, his voice was low and measured, lacking the warmth she had expected from their correspondence. "You would be Miss Mitchell," he said, not quite making it a question. There was no smile, no gesture of welcome, just a quiet assessment that made Sarah feel suddenly exposed and vulnerable. "Yes," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Harrison, I presume. I'm so pleased to finally meet you." William nodded curtly, his eyes never quite meeting hers. "I'll take you to the hotel," he said, reaching for her satchel. "We need to talk." The ride through town was conducted in uncomfortable silence. Sarah sat beside William on the wagon seat, acutely aware of the distance he maintained between them. The townspeople they passed looked up with curiosity, their expressions ranging from polite interest to something that looked disturbingly like pity. Sarah tried to make conversation, commenting on the beauty of the mountains and the charm of the town, but William's responses were brief and non-committal. The hotel was a modest two-story building with a wide front porch and windows that looked out onto the main street. William helped her down from the wagon with perfunctory courtesy, his touch brief and impersonal. As they entered the lobby, Sarah noticed the way the desk clerk's eyes moved between them, taking in William's tense posture and her own obvious nervousness. "I've arranged for a room," William said quietly. "We'll talk in the morning." Sarah's heart sank. She had expected to be taken to the ranch, to see the home they would share, to begin the new life she had traveled so far to find. Instead, she found herself alone in a small room with faded wallpaper and a window that looked out onto the empty street. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed, her hands folded in her lap, and tried to understand what she had done wrong. The morning brought no comfort. William arrived early, his face set in grim lines that spoke of a difficult night. He led her to a small parlor off the hotel lobby, where they sat across from each other in stiff-backed chairs that seemed to emphasize the distance between them. "Miss Mitchell," he began, his voice carefully controlled, "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding." Sarah's hands tightened in her lap. "I don't understand," she said, though part of her already did. William looked out the window, avoiding her eyes. "In your letters, you mentioned the fire that took your family. You said it was an accident, that you were fortunate to survive." "Yes," Sarah whispered, her throat constricting. "It was a terrible tragedy, but I was blessed to escape with my life." "I made some inquiries," William continued, his voice growing colder. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." Spoke to a man who knew someone in Boston. The fire wasn't an accident, Miss Mitchell. It was started by your brother, wasn't it? In one of his drunken rages. And you were there, you saw it happen, and you couldn't stop it. The words hit Sarah like physical blows. She had never told anyone the full truth about that night, about how she had watched helplessly as her brother Samuel, deep in his cups and wild with rage over some perceived slight, had knocked over a lamp in his fury. How she had tried to wake their sleeping parents and younger sister. How she had dragged Samuel toward the window even as he fought against her. How she had been forced to choose between saving herself and dying with them all. He was my brother, she said, her voice breaking. I couldn't leave him to die, even though what he did was unforgivable. William's expression softened slightly, but his resolve remained firm. I understand your loyalty, Miss Mitchell, but you must see that this changes things. The townspeople here, they're good Christian folk, but they're not comfortable with complications. A woman who was present at such a tragedy, who carries that kind of shadow. It wouldn't be fair to either of us. Sarah felt the familiar weight of shame settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. I see, she said quietly. And what would you have me do? I'll pay for your return journey, William said, his voice gentling slightly. It's the least I can do. I'm sorry, Miss Mitchell. In different circumstances, perhaps. But Sarah was no longer listening. She was remembering the whispers that had followed her through the streets of Boston, the way people had crossed themselves when she passed, the landlord who had refused to rent to her because he said she brought bad luck. She had thought distance would change things, that in the vast openness of the Colorado Territory, she might finally be free of the judgment that had haunted her. Instead, she had simply carried it with her like unwanted baggage. I understand, she said, rising from her chair with as much dignity as she could muster. Thank you for your honesty, Mr. Harrison. It's more than many would have given. William looked uncomfortable, perhaps recognizing the grace with which she was accepting his rejection. Miss Mitchell, I want you to know that this isn't about you as a person. You seem like a fine woman, and I'm sure that somewhere. Please, Sarah interrupted gently. There's no need for explanations. I'll make arrangements for my departure. But as she climbed the stairs to her room, Sarah knew she would not be returning to Boston. There was nothing left for her there but memories and ghosts. She had spent her last money on the journey west, and her pride would not allow her to accept charity from a man who had found her wanting. Whatever happened next, she would face it here in Millbrook, in the shadow of the mountains that had witnessed her humiliation, but might yet see her redemption. That afternoon, Sarah walked through the town with her head held high, her small savings clutched in her reticule. She passed the general store, the blacksmith shop, and the small white church with its modest steeple. The townspeople she encountered were polite but distant, their eyes holding the same mixture of curiosity and pity she had grown accustomed to. She felt their whispers following her like smoke, carrying the news of her rejection and the reasons behind it. At the edge of town, she found a small sign advertising rooms for rent above Dr. Whitmore's medical practice. The doctor himself was a kind-faced man in his 60s, with silver hair and gentle eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. When Sarah inquired about the room, he studied her with the professional assessment of someone accustomed to reading people's pain. You're the young woman who came to meet William Harrison, he said, and it wasn't a question. Sarah nodded, bracing herself for another rejection. Yes, sir. I understand if my presence in your building might be uncomfortable for your patients. Dr. Whitmore smiled, the expression transforming his entire face. My dear, I've been practicing medicine for over 30 years. I've seen every kind of tragedy and triumph that life can offer. What matters to me is character, not circumstances. The room is yours if you want it, and I could use an assistant. I understand you have some experience with healing. For the first time since arriving in Millbrook, Sarah felt tears of gratitude rather than shame. Thank you, she whispered. You don't know what this means to me." "I think I do," Dr. Whitmore said gently. "Now let's get you settled. Tomorrow we'll see about putting those healing hands of yours to good use." As Sarah climbed the narrow stairs to her new home, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Not hope, exactly, but something close to it. The room was small but clean, with a window that looked out over the mountains and a bed that was her own. She unpacked her few belongings, placing her mother's Bible on the small table and her collection of herbs in the wooden crate that would serve as her medicine chest. That night, as she lay in the narrow bed listening to the sounds of the town, settling into sleep, Sarah made a promise to herself. She would not run from her past anymore, but neither would she allow it to define her future. In the morning, she would begin again, not as the broken woman who had fled Boston in shame, but as someone who had learned that survival was its own form of courage. The mountains outside her window stood silent and eternal, their peaks catching the first light of dawn like beacons of possibility. Sarah closed her eyes and, for the first time in months, slept without dreams of fire. The first week in Dr. Whitmore's employment passed like a gentle balm on Sarah's wounded spirit. She found herself rising before dawn, not from restlessness or nightmares as she had in Boston, but from genuine eagerness to begin her day. The doctor's practice served the entire territory for miles around, and Sarah quickly discovered that her hands held an instinctive knowledge of healing that went beyond the formal training she had received at the Boston hospital. Whether it was preparing poultices for infected wounds or brewing teas to ease a colicky baby's distress, she moved through her tasks with a confidence that surprised even herself. Dr. Whitmore proved to be more than an employer. He became a mentor and friend. He taught her to read the subtle signs of illness that the body displayed before symptoms became obvious, showed her how to compound medicines from the wild herbs that grew abundantly in the mountain meadows, and, most importantly, demonstrated how to listen to patients not just with her ears but with her heart. The old doctor had a way of seeing past people's fears and shame to the core of their humanity, and Sarah found herself learning to do the same. The townspeople who came to the practice were initially wary of her. News of her rejection by William Harrison had spread through Millbrook like wildfire, carrying with it whispered speculations about her past and the reasons behind his decision. Some patients requested to see only Dr. Whitmore, their eyes avoiding Sarah's as they mumbled excuses about preferring the familiar touch of the old physician. Others simply stared at her with barely concealed curiosity, as if she were some exotic creature whose tragic history made her simultaneously fascinating and frightening. But Sarah had learned long ago that actions spoke louder than words or whispers. When Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, the baker's wife, came in with a badly burned hand from a kitchen accident, Sarah's gentle care and expert bandaging soon had the woman singing her praises. When little Tommy Morrison fell from a tree and broke his arm, Sarah's steady hands and soothing voice helped the boy through the painful setting of the bone. One by one, the people of Millbrook began to see past their preconceptions to the woman who stood before them, capable and caring despite whatever shadows might follow in her wake. Yet even as her days found their rhythm, Sarah could not escape the weight of the town's judgment. She felt it in the way conversations stopped when she entered the general store, in the slight hesitation before people returned her greetings, in the protective way mothers pulled their children a little closer. When she passed, the label of being broken clung to her like morning mist that refused to burn away even in the brightest sunlight. It was Margaret Stone, the blacksmith's wife, who finally spoke aloud what others only whispered. Sarah had been walking past the forge one afternoon when she heard raised voices from within. Maggie Stone's sharp tone carried clearly through the open doors as she argued with her husband about something. And when Sarah appeared in the doorway to ask about a set of medical instruments that needed repair, the conversation abruptly ceased. "Oh," Maggie said, her face flushing red with embarrassment. "Miss Mitchell, I didn't hear you approach. I hope I'm not interrupting, Sarah said politely, though the tension in the air was thick enough to cut. Dr. Whitmore sent me to inquire about his surgical tools. The blacksmith, a burly man with kind eyes and permanently stained hands, nodded toward a workbench where the instruments lay gleaming and sharp. Just finished them this morning. Good as new, maybe better. As Sarah examined the tools and counted out the payment, she became aware that both husband and wife were watching her with expressions she couldn't quite read. Finally, Maggie cleared her throat. Miss Mitchell, she began hesitantly, I hope you don't mind my asking, but is it true what they're saying about you? About why William Harrison changed his mind? Sarah's hands stilled on the instruments. She had been expecting this question for days, dreading it yet somehow relieved that someone had finally found the courage to ask directly rather than simply whispering behind her back. That depends, she said quietly, on what exactly they're saying. Maggie glanced at her husband, who nodded encouragingly. They say you come from tragedy, that you've seen terrible things, been through experiences that would break most people. They say William thought you were damaged goods. The words hung in the air like an accusation, though Sarah could hear the genuine curiosity rather than malice in Maggie's voice. She wrapped the surgical instruments carefully in their leather case, buying herself time to choose her words. My family died in a fire, she said finally. I was the only one who survived. Some people believe that makes me cursed, that tragedy follows me like a faithful dog. Perhaps they're right. Perhaps I am broken in ways that can't be mended. And do you believe that? Maggie asked, her voice surprisingly gentle. Sarah looked up, meeting the other woman's eyes directly. I believe that we are all broken in some way, Mrs. Stone. The question is whether we let those cracks define us, or whether we fill them with something stronger than what was there before. The blacksmith spoke up for the first time since their introduction. Seems to me, he said in his deep, gravelly voice, that a person who's been tested by fire and came through it might be stronger, not weaker. Metal that's been through the forge burns away the impurities, leaves behind something purer. His words were clearly meant as kindness, but they also carried an unintended sting. Sarah managed a wan smile as she gathered up the instruments and prepared to leave. Thank you both, she said, for your honesty, if nothing else. As she walked back to the medical practice, Sarah felt the familiar ache of isolation settling over her like a heavy shawl. Even well-meaning people saw her as something to be pitied or studied, a lesson in how tragedy could shape a soul. She was tired of being defined by the worst moment of her life, weary of carrying the weight of other people's expectations and judgments. That evening, as she helped Dr. Whitmore close the practice for the day, the old physician seemed to sense her melancholy mood. You're thinking too hard again, he said with the gentle authority of someone who had spent decades reading human nature. I can practically hear the wheels turning in your head from across the room. Sarah managed a small smile as she wiped down the examination table. I'm simply wondering if I made a mistake coming here. Perhaps I should have returned to Boston after all. And what waits for you in Boston? Dr. Whitmore asked, settling into his chair with a slight groan. More of the same whispers and sideways glances? At least here you have the chance to write a new story. The story seems to be writing itself, Sarah replied. And it's not a particularly pleasant one. Dr. Whitmore was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands folded in his lap. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of experience and hard-won wisdom. I came to Millbrook 15 years ago, he said. Did you know that? I wasn't born here, wasn't raised in these mountains. I came running from my own ghosts, my own failures. Sarah looked up in surprise. In all their conversations, the doctor had never mentioned his past beyond general references to his medical training. I was a surgeon in Denver, he continued. Had a thriving practice, a beautiful wife, a future that seemed bright as polished silver. Then I lost a patient, a child, during what should have been a routine operation. My hands shook at the crucial moment, and she died on my table. The pain in his voice was still fresh after all these years, and Sarah felt her heart constrict with sympathy. The child's father was a prominent businessman, and he made sure everyone in Denver knew about my failure. Patients stopped coming. Colleagues avoided me, and my wife. Well, she decided she couldn't live with a man who couldn't trust his own hands. I lost everything in the space of 6 months. But you kept practicing medicine, Sarah said softly. Because I learned that running from our failures doesn't heal them, Dr. Whitmore replied. It only gives them power over us. When I came to Millbrook, I was broken too. But this town gave me the chance to prove that one terrible moment doesn't define a lifetime of service. Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. How did you find the courage to trust yourself again? By understanding that courage isn't the absence of fear or doubt, the doctor said. It's acting in spite of them. Every time I pick up a scalpel, I remember that child's face. But I also remember every patient I've saved since then, every life I've been able to touch in a positive way. The past informs us, my dear, but it doesn't have to imprison us. That night, Sarah sat by her window looking out at the mountains. Their peaks silver in the moonlight. Dr. Whitmore's words echoed in her mind, challenging the narrative she had carried about herself for so long. Perhaps being broken wasn't a permanent condition, but a temporary state, like a bone that knits back stronger after it heals. The next morning brought an unexpected test of that philosophy. Sarah was grinding herbs in the back room of the practice when she heard raised voices from the front office. She emerged to find Dr. Whitmore trying to calm a distraught woman who held a crying infant in her arms. "Please, doctor," the woman was saying, her voice thick with panic. "She's been burning with fever for 2 days. I don't know what else to do." Dr. Whitmore was already reaching for the child when the woman's eyes fell on Sarah. Her expression immediately hardened, and she pulled the baby closer to her chest. "I don't want her touching my child," the woman said firmly. "I've heard the stories. I won't have someone cursed laying hands on my daughter." Sarah felt the familiar sting of rejection, but this time it was tempered by concern for the sick infant. The baby's cries were weak and raspy, and even from across the room, Sarah could see the telltale flush of dangerous fever. "Mrs. Patterson," Dr. Whitmore said with unusual sharpness, "your daughter needs immediate attention. Miss Mitchell is my assistant, and she's trained in—" "I don't care what she's trained in," Mrs. Patterson interrupted. "I want you to treat my baby, not some woman who brings bad luck wherever she goes." The infant's cries were growing weaker, and Sarah could see the fear in the mother's eyes beneath her prejudice. Without a word, Sarah moved to the medicine cabinet and began gathering the supplies she knew Dr. Whitmore would need. Willow bark for the fever, honey and herbs for a poultice to ease the child's labored breathing, clean cloths for bathing the hot little body. "Mrs. Patterson," Sarah said quietly, her hands steady as she prepared the remedies, "I understand your concern. But your daughter is very sick, and she needs help now. Dr. Whitmore's eyes aren't what they used to be, and his hands sometimes tremble with age. You can watch everything I do, question every step, but please don't let your fears prevent your child from getting the care she needs." The woman looked between Sarah and Dr. Whitmore, her maternal instincts warring with her superstitions. The baby's breathing grew more labored, and finally, desperation won out over prejudice. "Fine," Mrs. Patterson said through gritted teeth. "But I'm watching every move you make." For the next hour, Sarah worked with quiet efficiency under the mother's suspicious gaze. She bathed the baby's fevered body with cool water infused with healing herbs, administered carefully measured doses of medicine, and created a steam tent to help ease the child's congested breathing. Throughout it all, she spoke in soft, soothing tones, not just to the infant, but to the frightened mother as well. Gradually, the baby's breathing eased and her fever began to break. The flush faded from her cheeks, and she fell into the peaceful sleep of healing rather than the restless tossing of illness. Mrs. Patterson watched in amazement as her daughter's condition improved, her earlier hostility slowly giving way to grudging respect. "How did you know what to do?" she asked quietly as Sarah cleaned up the supplies. "Experience," Sarah replied simply. "I've seen this kind of fever before. Caught early, it responds well to the right treatment." Mrs. Patterson was quiet for a long moment, studying Sarah with new eyes. "I owe you an apology," she said finally. "And more than that, I owe you my daughter's life." "You owe me nothing," Sarah said gently. "A mother's protective instincts are never wrong, even when they're misdirected. I'm just grateful she's feeling better." As Mrs. Patterson prepared to leave with her now peacefully sleeping daughter, she paused at the door. "Miss Mitchell," she said hesitantly, I hope you'll forgive the things I said. Sometimes fear makes us say and do things we don't really mean." "There's nothing to forgive," Sarah replied, though she could feel the walls around her heart beginning to crack just a little. "We all do what we think is best for the people we love." After they left, Dr. Whitmore looked at Sarah with obvious pride. "You handled that beautifully, my dear. Both the medical emergency and the personal one." "It doesn't change anything," Sarah said quietly. "She go home and tell people what happened, but they'll still see me as the woman who brings bad luck. One good deed doesn't erase a reputation." "Perhaps not," Dr. Whitmore agreed. "But it plants a seed of doubt in the certainty of their judgment. And sometimes that's all it takes for people to begin seeing things differently." As the days passed, Sarah began to notice subtle changes in how some of the townspeople treated her. Mrs. Patterson had indeed spread the story of her daughter's recovery, and while many still regarded Sarah with suspicion, others began to look at her with something approaching curiosity rather than fear. A few even smiled and nodded when they passed her on the street, small gestures that felt like unexpected gifts. But the isolation was still there, the sense of being perpetually on the outside looking in. Sarah threw herself into her work with Dr. Whitmore, finding solace in the concrete ways she could help people heal. She expanded her knowledge of mountain herbs, learned to compound increasingly complex medicines, and even began assisting with minor surgical procedures. Yet in the quiet moments when the practice was closed and she sat alone in her small room, the loneliness was a constant companion. She had traded the hostile whispers of Boston for the suspicious silence of Millbrook, but the end result was much the same. She was still a woman defined by tragedy, still someone others saw as fundamentally different, marked by experiences that set her apart from normal life. One evening, as autumn began to paint the mountains in shades of gold and scarlet, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. Eleanor Hartwell knocked on the door of the medical practice just as Sarah was preparing to close for the day. "Mrs. Hartwell," Sarah said with surprise, "is everything all right? How is your hand healing?" The baker's wife smiled, flexing her fingers to show how well the burn had mended. "Good as new, thanks to your care. But that's not why I'm here." Eleanor glanced around the empty office, then lowered her voice conspiratorially. "There's going to be a town social next week, a harvest celebration at the church. The Women's Auxiliary is organizing it, and we need all the help we can get with the cooking and decorating." Sarah felt a flutter of something that might have been hope, quickly followed by the more familiar weight of caution. "That's very kind of you to think of me, but I'm not sure I would be welcome at such an event." "Nonsense," Eleanor said briskly. "You're part of this community now, whether certain people like it or not. Besides, we need someone who knows how to organize things properly, and from what Dr. Whitmore tells me, you've got a head for details." The invitation was clearly meant as a kindness, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that accepting would only lead to more uncomfortable encounters and whispered conversations. She had learned to find peace in her solitude, to take satisfaction in her work without needing the approval of others. "I appreciate the thought," she said carefully, "but I think it would be better if I stayed away. I wouldn't want to make anyone uncomfortable." Eleanor's expression grew firm, taking on the look of a woman who had made up her mind about something and would not be easily dissuaded. "Sarah Mitchell," she said, using Sarah's first name for the first time, "I'm going to tell you something that may sting a bit, but it needs saying. You can't spend your whole life walking on eggshells around other people's prejudices. If you keep making yourself small to accommodate their comfort, you'll disappear entirely." The words hit Sarah with unexpected force, mainly because they echoed thoughts she had been trying not to acknowledge. Had she become so accustomed to rejection that she was now rejecting herself before others could do it for her? "Some of the ladies in this town have made up their minds about you based on gossip and speculation," Eleanor continued. "But others are waiting to see who you really are. If you don't give them that chance, how can you blame them for believing the stories?" That night, Sarah lay awake thinking about Eleanor's words. She had come to Millbrook hoping to start fresh, but instead, she had simply built new walls around herself, different from the ones in Boston, but equally confining. Perhaps it was time to stop hiding behind the protection of isolation and step into the light, whatever the consequences might be. The next morning, she found Eleanor at the bakery and quietly accepted the invitation to help with the harvest. Social. The other woman's face lit up with genuine pleasure, and for the first time since arriving in Millbrook, Sarah felt like she might actually belong somewhere. But as she walked back to the medical practice, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking towards something that would change everything. Whether that change would bring healing or heartbreak remained to be seen, but she was finally ready to find out which it would be. The harvest's social preparations consumed the better part of a week, and Sarah found herself swept into a world of activity she hadn't experienced since her childhood. The church basement became a hive of industrious women, their sleeves rolled up and their voices mingling in animated conversation as they planned decorations, organized food contributions, and debated the merits of various entertainment options. For the evening's festivities, Sarah arrived each morning after completing her duties at Dr. Whitmore's practice, her arms laden with whatever supplies Eleanor had requested the day before. At first, her presence created pockets of awkward silence among the other women, conversations that died mid-sentence when she approached and resumed in hushed tones after she passed. But Eleanor proved to be a formidable ally, smoothly integrating Sarah into tasks and discussions with the natural authority of someone accustomed to organizing community events. "Sarah, dear," Eleanor would call out across the basement, "could you give Mrs. Henderson a hand with those garlands? You have such clever fingers for delicate work." Or, "Sarah knows about preserving herbs, don't you? Perhaps you could advise Mrs. Cooper on which ones would be best for the centerpieces." Gradually, the other women began to interact with Sarah directly rather than speaking around her as if she were an unfortunate piece of furniture that had to be worked around. She discovered that Mrs. Henderson, the minister's wife, had a sharp wit beneath her pious exterior, and that Mrs. Cooper, who ran the boarding house, possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of every scandal that had rocked Millbrook in the past 20 years. "Of course, we don't usually talk about such things," Mrs. Cooper confided to Sarah as they arranged autumn leaves around glass hurricane lamps. "But between you and me, every family in this town has its secrets, the Harrisons included." Sarah's hands stilled on the leaves she was arranging. "Oh?" Mrs. Cooper glanced around to make sure they wouldn't be overheard, then leaned closer. "William Harrison's first wife didn't die of consumption like he tells people. She took her own life, poor soul. Couldn't bear the isolation of that ranch, and William was always more interested in his cattle than his wife. Found her in the barn one morning with a rope around her neck." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. The man who had rejected her for being broken carried his own terrible secret his own burden of tragedy and failure. She felt a complex mixture of emotions, anger at his hypocrisy warring with sympathy for his loss. That's why he wanted a mail-order bride, Mrs. Cooper continued, warming to her subject. Figured someone desperate enough to travel all that way wouldn't be too particular about romance or attention. But when he heard about your family and that fire, well, I suppose he got spooked about having another tragedy on his property. Mrs. Cooper, Sarah said quietly, perhaps we shouldn't be discussing Mr. Harrison's private affairs. The older woman looked surprised by Sarah's gentle reproof. You're defending him? After the way he treated you? Sarah carefully arranged another leaf, considering her words. I think we all carry pain in different ways. Perhaps Mr. Harrison's rejection wasn't really about me at all, but about his own fears. Mrs. Cooper studied Sarah with new interest. You're more generous than most would be in your position. I'm not sure I'd be so understanding if I'd been left standing at a train station like discarded luggage. The conversation troubled Sarah for the rest of the afternoon. She had spent weeks feeling ashamed of her own past, accepting the judgment that she was somehow tainted by tragedy. Now she wondered how many other people in Millbrook were hiding their own wounds behind facades of respectability and normalcy. As the day of the social approached, Sarah found herself growing increasingly anxious about the event. She had purchased fabric from the general store and sewn herself a new dress. For the occasion, a simple but elegant creation in deep green wool that complemented her auburn hair. The dress fit her well, accentuating her natural curves without being immodest, and when she looked at herself in the small mirror above her washstand, she saw not a broken woman, but someone who had survived terrible circumstances and was still standing. The evening of the harvest social dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of crystalline air that made the mountains look close enough to touch. Sarah spent extra time arranging her hair, pinning it up in a style that was both fashionable and practical, and applying a small amount of rose water to her pulse points. As she prepared to leave her room, she caught sight of herself in the mirror and felt a flutter of something that might have been hope. The church basement had been transformed into a warm and welcoming space, with lanterns casting golden light over tables laden with food and decorations that spoke of the season's bounty. Pumpkins and gourds nestled among arrangements of autumn leaves, and the air was rich with the scents of apple cider, fresh bread, and cinnamon. A small area had been cleared for dancing, and the church's old piano had been moved into position for the evening's entertainment. Sarah arrived precisely on time, her hands carrying an apple pie she had baked that afternoon using her mother's recipe. The basement was already filling with families dressed in their Sunday best, children running between the adults while their parents called for them to mind their manners. The sound of laughter and conversation filled the space with warmth that had nothing to do with the wood stoves that heated the room. Eleanor spotted Sarah immediately and hurried over to greet her, taking the pie with genuine appreciation. Sarah, you look absolutely lovely. That color is perfect on you. Come, let me introduce you to some of the families you haven't met yet. What followed was a whirlwind of introductions and polite conversations. Some of the people Sarah met had clearly heard stories about her and approached with poorly concealed curiosity, but others seemed genuinely pleased to make her acquaintance. She spoke with the schoolteacher about her experiences in Boston, discussed medicinal herbs with several of the ranch wives, and found herself drawn into a lively debate about the best methods for preserving vegetables through the winter. As the evening progressed, Sarah began to relax into the rhythm of the social gathering. She helped serve food, admired the children's costumes in the harvest pageant, and even found herself laughing at stories shared by some of the older residents about the early days of Millbrook's founding. For the first time since arriving in town, she felt like she might actually belong somewhere. The dancing began after supper, with the minister's son providing accompaniment on the piano. Sarah had positioned herself near the wall, content to watched the couples whirl around the makeshift dance floor when she noticed a commotion near the entrance to the basement. A man had entered, removing his hat as he surveyed the gathering, and the conversations around him seemed to falter slightly. Sarah's first impression was of someone who moved with careful deliberation, as if each step required conscious thought. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that showed traces of premature silver at the temples, and a face that spoke of experiences that aged a man beyond his years. What struck her most, however, was that his left sleeve was pinned up at the shoulder, the absence of his arm clearly visible despite his attempt to position himself to minimize its prominence. The man's eyes swept the room, taking in the festivities with an expression that was neither welcoming nor hostile, simply observant. When his gaze fell on Sarah, she felt an unexpected jolt of recognition, not because she had seen him before, but because she recognized something in his carefully guarded expression. Here was someone else who understood what it meant to be marked by circumstances beyond their control, someone who had learned to navigate a world that saw disability or difference as something to be pitied or feared. Eleanor appeared at Sarah's side, following her gaze toward the newcomer. "That's Thomas Reed," she said quietly. "Tom, most people call him. He owns the hardware store on Main Street. Good man, but keeps to himself mostly. Was he injured in the war?" Sarah asked, her voice equally low. "Indian conflicts out in Arizona territory, from what I've heard. Lost his arm in a skirmish about 5 years ago. Came here afterward to start fresh, much like you did. People respect him well enough, but he doesn't socialize much." Sarah watched as Tom moved through the gathering, exchanging polite greetings with various townspeople, but maintaining a certain distance even in conversation. She noticed how he positioned himself to keep his missing arm away from others, how he declined invitations to join in activities that might highlight his limitation, how he seemed to participate in the social gathering while somehow remaining separate from it. "Why did he come tonight if he doesn't usually attend social events?" Sarah asked. Eleanor shrugged. "Church socials are different. Everyone's expected to make an appearance, show community spirit. Even the hermits venture out for harvest celebrations." As if sensing their discussion, Tom looked in their direction again. This time, his eyes lingered on Sarah for a moment longer than politeness dictated, and she felt an odd flutter of something she couldn't quite identify. There was intelligence in his gaze and a wariness that spoke of someone who had learned to read people carefully before trusting them. The evening continued around them, but Sarah found herself increasingly aware of Tom's presence. She watched him interact with other townspeople, noting the respectful but somewhat distant way they treated him. It reminded her uncomfortably of her own experiences in Millbrook, the way people could be kind while still maintaining an invisible barrier that marked you as different, other, somehow separate from the normal flow of community life. When the dancing reached its peak and couples filled the small floor, Sarah noticed that Tom had positioned himself near the back of the room, observing but clearly not participating. A few of the unmarried women had glanced in his direction hopefully, but none had approached him directly. Sarah wondered if they were deterred by his disability or simply by the air of self-sufficiency that seemed to surround him like armor. "Excuse me," she said to Eleanor, surprising herself with her sudden decision. "I think I'll get some fresh air." The evening had grown warm despite the autumn chill outside, and Sarah made her way toward the stairs that led up to the main floor of the church. She needed a moment to process the complex emotions the evening had stirred up. For the first time since arriving in Millbrook, she had felt truly welcomed by a group of people, had experienced the warmth of community acceptance that she had been craving. Yet the sight of Tom Reed had reminded her that acceptance often came with conditions, that being truly seen and valued for who you were beneath the surface remained a rare gift. She climbed the stairs and stepped outside into the crisp night air, breathing deeply of the mountain atmosphere that still carried hints of wood smoke and the approaching winter. The stars overhead were brilliant in the clear sky, and the mountains loomed like sleeping giants against the horizon. Sarah pulled her shawl closer around her shoulders and walked a few steps away from the church entrance, savoring the quiet after the noise and warmth of the basement gathering. "Beautiful night." The voice came from the shadows beside the church, and Sarah started slightly before recognizing Tom Reed's tall figure. He stepped into the light cast by the church windows, his hat in his right hand and his expression apologetic. "I didn't mean to startle you," he said. "I came out for some air myself and saw you leave the social." "It's quite all right," Sarah replied, her heart still beating a little faster from the surprise. "I needed a moment to clear my head." "It's been a long evening," Tom nodded, understanding flickering in his eyes. Social gatherings can be overwhelming when you're not used to them, especially when you know people are watching, forming opinions. There was something in his tone that suggested personal experience with exactly that kind of scrutiny, and Sarah felt a kinship with this quiet man who seemed to understand the weight of being perpetually observed and judged. "Do you find it gets easier?" she asked. "Living with people's expectations and assumptions?" Tom was quiet for a long moment, considering her question. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. "I've learned that most people's assumptions say more about them than they do about us," he said. "The trick is not letting their limitations become our own." "That's easier said than done," Sarah observed. "True enough," Tom agreed. "But the alternative is letting other people's fears and prejudices write the story of our lives. I found that's too high a price to pay for their comfort." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, both gazing up at the star-filled sky. Sarah felt an odd sense of peace in Tom's presence, a lack of the tension and careful self-monitoring that usually accompanied her interactions with others. Perhaps it was because she sensed that he, too, understood what it meant to be marked by circumstances beyond his control. "I should return to the social," Sarah said finally. "Eleanor will wonder what became of me." "Of course," Tom replied, stepping back to give her space to pass. "It was a pleasure to meet you properly, Miss Mitchell. Dr. Whitmore speaks very highly of your work." Sarah paused, surprised by the mention of her employer. "You know Dr. Whitmore?" "He treated my arm when I first arrived in Millbrook," Tom explained. "Good man, excellent physician." He mentioned that he had found an assistant who understood healing in ways that couldn't be taught from books. The compliment, filtered through Dr. Whitmore's professional assessment, meant more to Sarah than all the polite conversation she had exchanged that evening. It suggested that Tom saw her as something more than the tragic figure the town gossips had painted her to be. "Thank you," she said simply. "That means a great deal coming from someone Dr. Whitmore trusts." As she turned to go back inside, Tom spoke again, his voice carrying a note of hesitation that suggested he was venturing into unfamiliar territory. "Miss Mitchell, if you ever find yourself in need of anything from the hardware store, please don't hesitate to ask. I keep odd hours, but I'm usually there if you need supplies for Dr. Whitmore's practice." The offer was clearly more than professional. Courtesy, though it was couched in practical terms that allowed both of them to maintain their dignity. Sarah felt that flutter of something indefinable again, a warmth that had nothing to do with the mild evening air. "I'll remember that," she said. "Good evening, Mr. Reed." "Good evening, Miss Mitchell." Sarah returned to the social with her thoughts in pleasant turmoil. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of conversation and activity, but she found herself glancing toward the stairs periodically, wondering if Tom would return to the gathering. He didn't, and when the social finally began to wind down, and families started gathering their children and preparing to leave, Sarah realized that their brief conversation had been the most genuine exchange she had experienced in months. As she walked home through the quiet streets of Millbrook, her shawl wrapped tightly against the autumn chill, Sarah reflected on the evening's revelations. The social had shown her that acceptance and belonging were possible, but her encounter with Tom Reed had suggested something even more valuable, the possibility of being truly understood by someone. who shared similar experiences of being judged and found wanting by societal standards. For the first time since arriving in Colorado, Sarah felt something beyond mere hope for survival or basic acceptance. She felt the stirring of possibility, the sense that perhaps her story was not ending with William Harrison's rejection, but simply taking an unexpected turn toward something she had never dared to imagine. The next morning brought a return to routine, but Sarah found herself approaching her work with renewed energy. Dr. Whitmore commented on her improved spirits as they prepared for the day's patients, and Sarah realized that the social had accomplished something she hadn't expected. It had reminded her that she was capable of connection, of finding her place in a community despite the shadows that followed her. Over the following days, Sarah found herself thinking often about her conversation with Tom Reed. There had been something in his manner, a quiet strength and understanding that stayed with her as she went about her daily tasks. She caught herself glancing toward the hardware store when she walked past on errands, wondering what his days were like, whether he experienced the same sense of isolation that had plagued her since arriving in Millbrook. It was Eleanor who provided the opening Sarah hadn't realized she was looking for. The baker's wife appeared at the medical practice one afternoon with a proposition that seemed innocent enough on the surface. "Sarah, dear," Eleanor began, settling herself into one of the chairs in the practice's waiting area, "I have a favor to ask. The Women's Auxiliary is organizing a winter preparedness initiative, checking on the elderly residents to make sure they have adequate supplies before the snows get heavy. We need someone to coordinate with the hardware store about what might be needed in terms of repairs, heating supplies, that sort of thing." Sarah looked up from the medicine she was compounding, immediately suspicious of Eleanor's overly casual tone. "And you'd like me to speak with Mr. Reed about this?" "Well, you did have such a nice conversation with him at the social," Eleanor said with feigned innocence. "And he's more likely to give us fair prices if he understands it's for community welfare rather than profit." "Mrs. Hartwell," Sarah said, unable to suppress a smile, "are you attempting to play matchmaker?" Eleanor's face assumed an expression of wounded dignity. "I'm simply trying to ensure that our elderly residents are properly cared for through the winter months. If that happens to require cooperation between two people who seem well suited to each other, well, that's merely a fortunate coincidence." Despite her amusement at Eleanor's transparent scheming, Sarah found herself intrigued by the possibility of a legitimate reason to visit Tom Reed's hardware store. She had been curious about his business, about how he managed the physical demands of running such an enterprise with only one arm, but had lacked any reasonable excuse to satisfy that curiosity. "Very well," she said, setting aside her mortar and pestle. "I'll speak with Mr. Reed about the Winter Preparedness Initiative, but only because it's genuinely important work, not because of any romantic notions you might be harboring." Eleanor's smile was triumphant. "Of course, dear. Purely practical considerations." That afternoon, Sarah made her way to Reed's Hardware and Supplies with a carefully prepared list of items that might be needed for the winter welfare checks. The store occupied a narrow building on Main Street, its windows displaying an assortment of tools, household goods, and practical items that spoke to the needs of a frontier community. A painted sign above the door proclaimed the establishment's name in simple, bold letters, and the sound of her footsteps on the wooden sidewalk seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet afternoon air. Sarah paused for a moment before entering, smoothing her skirt and checking that her hat was properly positioned. She told herself that her nervousness was simply due to the unfamiliarity of the situation, but she knew it had more to do with the anticipation of seeing Tom Reed again, of discovering whether their connection at the social had been real or merely a product of her own loneliness and wishful thinking. The bell above the door chimed softly as she entered, and Sarah was immediately struck by the organization and cleanliness of the store's interior. Every tool had its place, every item was clearly labeled and easily accessible, and despite the Obvious challenges of managing such an inventory single-handedly. Nothing seemed haphazard or neglected. Tom emerged from behind the counter, his expression brightening with what appeared to be genuine pleasure when he recognized her. "Miss Mitchell," he said, his voice carrying a warmth that hadn't been present in their brief conversation at the social. "This is an unexpected pleasure. What can I do for you today?" Sarah felt her carefully prepared speech about winter supplies dissolve under the warmth of Tom's welcome. Standing in his well-organized store, surrounded by the tools and implements of practical mountain living, she realized how much thought he had put into creating a space that worked efficiently despite his physical limitations. Every shelf was positioned at the perfect height for his reach. Every frequently used item was within easy access of his right hand, and the entire layout spoke of careful planning and determined independence. "I'm here on behalf of the women's auxiliary," she began, then found herself adding, "though I confess I'm also curious about your establishment. Dr. Whitmore speaks highly of the quality of your work." Tom's smile held a hint of pride mixed with something that might have been relief. "The doctor has been generous with his recommendations. Please, let me show you around while we discuss what the auxiliary might need." As they walked through the store, Tom explained how he had modified various processes to accommodate his disability, speaking matter-of-factly about challenges that would have defeated many men. He had designed special clamps and vices that allowed him to work metal and wood single-handedly, created storage systems that maximized efficiency, and developed relationships with suppliers who understood his unique requirements. "The key," he said, demonstrating how he could manipulate a complex piece of machinery using leverage and careful positioning, "is not trying to do things the way a two-handed person would. Once you stop fighting your limitations and start working with them, you discover capabilities you never knew you had." Sarah watched him work with growing admiration. There was no self-pity in his manner, no bitter resignation, just practical intelligence applied to the business of living. When he lifted heavy items, he used his whole body as a lever. When he needed to hold multiple pieces simultaneously, he employed clever arrangements of clamps and braces. Everything he did was accomplished with a fluid efficiency that spoke of long practice and determined adaptation. "How long did it take you to develop these techniques?" Sarah asked, genuinely fascinated by his innovations. "About 2 years. Of trial and error," Tom admitted, securing a piece of lumber in a specially designed vise. "The first year was mostly frustration and broken projects. The second year, I started thinking like an engineer instead of a disabled soldier." The casual mention of his military service opened a door Sarah had been uncertain about approaching. "Where did you serve?" she asked gently. Tom's hands stilled on his work for a moment, and Sarah saw the familiar shadow cross his features that she recognized from her own experience with painful memories. "Arizona Territory," he said finally. "Part of a cavalry unit tasked with protecting settlers and maintaining peace with the Apache. We weren't particularly successful at either objective." Sarah heard the weight of complicated history in those simple words. "Is that where you were injured?" "An ambush in a canyon that we should never have entered," Tom replied, his voice taking on the careful neutrality of someone recounting events he had examined many times. "Our commanding officer was young and eager to prove himself. He led us into terrain that favored the enemy, ignored the advice of his experienced sergeants, and got half the unit killed or wounded for the sake of his military ambitions." The bitterness in his voice was controlled but unmistakable, and Sarah understood that Tom's injury carried not just physical pain, but the emotional burden of senseless loss. "I was lucky," he continued, returning to his work with perhaps more force than necessary. "The Apache could have killed me instead of just taking my arm. Plenty of good men died that day because of one man's pride and stupidity." Sarah watched him struggle with memories that clearly still had the power to wound, as she felt a kinship with his pain that went beyond sympathy. Do you ever wonder why you survived when others didn't? Tom looked up at her, his eyes searching her face, as if trying to determine whether her question came from genuine understanding or mere curiosity. Whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him, because his expression softened slightly. Every day for the first year, he admitted, I couldn't see any purpose in being spared just to live as half a man in a world that had no use for damaged soldiers. But eventually, I realized that survival itself might be the purpose. Maybe we're meant to be proof that people can endure more than they think possible. The conversation had moved far beyond hardware supplies and winter preparations, entering territory that neither of them had expected to explore. Sarah felt the familiar tension that accompanied the sharing of painful truths, but also a sense of relief at being able to speak honestly with someone who understood the complex emotions that accompanied surviving trauma. I sometimes feel guilty about surviving my family's fire, she found herself saying, the words emerging before her conscious mind could censor them. As if I should have found a way to save them all, or died trying. Tom set down his tools and gave her his full attention, his expression grave but understanding. Survivor's guilt is a burden that follows us everywhere, isn't it? The constant question of whether we deserve to live when others didn't. Do you think it ever goes away? Sarah asked, surprised by her own boldness in voicing the question. That had haunted her for months. I think it changes, Tom said thoughtfully. Instead of asking why we survived, maybe we learn to ask what we're supposed to do with the time we've been given. The guilt becomes a responsibility rather than a punishment. Their eyes met across the workbench, and Sarah felt a moment of perfect understanding pass between them. Here was someone who truly comprehended the weight she carried, who had wrestled with the same demons and found a way to transform them into something approaching purpose. The bell above the store's door chimed, breaking the intimate spell of their conversation. A rancher entered, looking for replacement parts for a broken harness, and Tom smoothly shifted into his professional persona. Sarah watched him interact with the customer, noting how he managed to complete the transaction and provide expert advice without drawing attention to his missing arm. The rancher left satisfied, apparently having never given Tom's disability a second thought. You handled that very well, Sarah observed after the customer departed. Practice, Tom replied simply. Most people are uncomfortable with difference until they see competence. Once they trust that I can do the job, they stop seeing the missing arm. Is that what you meant about not letting other people's limitations become our own? Tom nodded, beginning to clean up his workspace with practiced efficiency. People will treat us however we train them to treat us. If we act like victims, they'll pity us. If we act like we're dangerous or cursed, they'll fear us. But if we act like capable human beings who happen to have faced difficult circumstances, most of them will eventually follow our lead. Sarah considered this philosophy as she watched him work. It was both liberating and challenging, suggesting that she had more control over her social situation than she had realized, but also placing the responsibility for change squarely on her own shoulders. Now, Tom said, turning his attention back to her with a slight smile, let's discuss what the Women's Auxiliary actually needs for this winter preparedness initiative. They spent the next hour going over Sarah's list, with Tom making practical suggestions and offering significant discounts for community welfare purchases. His knowledge of the local climate and the specific needs of elderly residents was extensive, and Sarah found herself genuinely grateful for Eleanor's matchmaking scheme, regardless of its romantic motivations. As their business discussion wound down, Tom surprised her with an unexpected invitation. "Miss Mitchell," he said, his voice carrying a note of careful hesitation, "I wonder if you might be interested in seeing something that relates to your medical work. I've been experimenting with adaptive tools that might be useful for people with various physical limitations. Dr. Whitmore mentioned that you sometimes treat patients with long-term injuries or disabilities." Sarah's interest was immediately piqued. What kind of adaptive tools? Modified eating utensils, writing. Implements, tools for household tasks that can be operated single-handedly or with limited mobility. I started making them for my own use, but I realized they might help other people facing similar challenges. The invitation to see his private workshop felt like a significant gesture of trust, and Sarah found herself accepting before she had fully considered the implications. "I'd be very interested to see your innovations," she said. "When would be convenient? Are you free this Sunday afternoon? The store is closed, so we wouldn't be interrupted by customers." Sarah agreed, and as she prepared to leave the hardware store, she realized that their interaction had evolved far beyond a simple business transaction. They had shared personal stories, discovered common ground in their experiences with trauma and recovery, and established the foundation for what felt like genuine friendship. The prospect of spending more time with Tom filled her with an anticipation she hadn't experienced since arriving in Millbrook. The days leading up to Sunday passed with unusual slowness. Sarah found herself thinking about Tom at odd moments. During her work with Dr. Whitmore, wondering about his workshop, his inventions, and the life he had built for himself in Millbrook. She also found herself paying more attention to her appearance, selecting her clothes with care, and spending extra time arranging her hair. Dr. Whitmore, with the observational skills of a longtime physician, seemed to notice her improved spirits. "You seem remarkably cheerful lately, my dear," he commented as they organized supplies on Friday afternoon. "I take it the harvest social was a success?" "It was pleasant," Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice casual. "I met several interesting people." "Ah," Dr. Whitmore said with a knowing smile. "Anyone in particular?" Sarah felt her cheeks warm slightly. "I had a nice conversation with Mr. Reed from the hardware store. He seems like a thoughtful man." "Indeed he is," the doctor agreed. "Tom Reed is one of the finest men in this territory. He's overcome challenges that would have broken lesser individuals, and he's done so with grace and dignity. If you're developing a friendship with him, I can only approve." The doctor's endorsement meant a great deal to Sarah, confirming her own positive impressions of Tom's character. She had learned to trust Dr. Whitmore's judgment about people, and his obvious respect for Tom added another layer of attraction to her growing interest. Sunday afternoon arrived clear and crisp, with the kind of brilliant mountain sunshine that made everything look newly minted. Sarah had chosen her outfit carefully, settling on a practical but attractive walking dress in warm brown wool, with a cream-colored shawl that complemented her auburn hair. She carried a small basket containing fresh rolls she had baked that morning, a gesture of appreciation for Tom's time in hospitality. The hardware store looked different on a Sunday, quieter and more intimate without the bustle of commercial activity. Tom greeted her at the door with what appeared to be genuine pleasure, and Sarah noticed that he too had taken extra care with his appearance. His shirt was freshly pressed, his hair neatly combed, and there was an air of nervous anticipation about him that she found endearing. "Thank you for coming," he said, accepting the basket of rolls with obvious appreciation. "I confess I've been looking forward to showing someone my workshop. It gets lonely working in isolation all the time." He led her through the store to a door she hadn't noticed during her previous visit, which opened onto a staircase leading to the building's second floor. The workshop occupied the entire upper level, with large windows that provided excellent natural light and workbenches arranged to take advantage of the space and illumination. Sarah was immediately impressed by the organization and ingenuity displayed throughout the room. Tools hung from carefully positioned pegs and hooks, all within easy reach of Tom's right hand. Multiple workstations were set up for different types of projects, and every surface was clean and orderly despite obvious evidence of regular use. "This is remarkable," Sarah said, genuinely awed by what she saw. "You've created a complete manufacturing facility up here." "It's taken time to get everything arranged properly," Tom admitted, his pride evident despite his modest tone. But now I can work almost as efficiently as I did before my injury, sometimes more so because I've eliminated unnecessary motions and optimized every process. He began showing her his adaptive tools, starting with modified eating utensils that could be operated with limited hand mobility. The designs were elegant in their simplicity, incorporating weights, springs, and clever mechanical advantages that allowed people with various disabilities to maintain independence in basic daily activities. This spoon, he explained, demonstrating its use, has a weighted handle that compensates for hand tremors, and the bowl is designed to make it easier to scoop food without spillage. I made it for an elderly man whose hands shake from age, but it would work equally well for someone recovering from a stroke or dealing with other neurological conditions. Sarah examined the utensil carefully, immediately recognizing its potential value for several of Dr. Whitmore's patients. Have you considered making these commercially? I can think of dozens of people who would benefit from such innovations. I've thought about it, Tom replied, but I wasn't sure there would be sufficient demand to justify the effort. Most people seem to assume that disabled individuals should simply learn to live with their limitations rather than expecting accommodation. That's exactly the kind of thinking you were describing in your store, Sarah observed. Letting other people's limitations become our own. Perhaps it's time to challenge those assumptions. Tom's eyes lit up with interest. You really think there might be a market for adaptive tools? I think there are countless people struggling with daily tasks who would be grateful for solutions that restore their independence, Sarah said firmly. The question is how to reach them and demonstrate the value of what you've created. They spent the next 2 hours exploring Tom's various inventions, from writing implements designed for people with limited hand function to household tools that could be operated with minimal physical strength. Each item represented hours of careful thought and experimentation, driven by Tom's understanding of the frustrations faced by people with physical limitations. As the afternoon progressed, their conversation ranged far beyond adaptive tools. They discussed their respective experiences adjusting to life in Millbrook, shared stories about their professional challenges and satisfactions, and discovered a surprising number of common interests and values. Tom had been an avid reader before. His military service and his isolation since arriving in Colorado had given him ample time to revisit that passion. Sarah was delighted to discover that they had read many of the same books and shared similar tastes in literature. I have a confession to make, Tom said as they took a break from examining his inventions to share coffee and Sarah's fresh rolls. I've been wanting to ask you about your medical training ever since Dr. Whitmore mentioned your background. It's unusual for a woman to have such extensive knowledge of healing practices. Sarah found herself telling him about her work at the Boston City Hospital, her training in wound care and herbal medicine, and her discovery that she had an intuitive understanding of the healing process that went beyond formal education. Tom listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions and offering observations that demonstrated his own practical knowledge of anatomy and physiology, gained through his military experience and subsequent adaptation to his disability. You know, he said thoughtfully, there might be an opportunity for collaboration between your medical knowledge and my tool-making abilities. I understand the physical challenges faced by people with various limitations, and you understand the medical aspects of their conditions. Together, we might be able to develop more effective solutions. The suggestion of working together sent a thrill of excitement through Sarah that had nothing to do with professional opportunity and everything to do with the prospect of spending more time with this remarkable man. But she also recognized the genuine potential for meaningful collaboration. That's an intriguing possibility, she said carefully. What did you have in mind? Nothing formal initially, Tom replied. But perhaps you could bring me information about specific challenges faced by Dr. Whitmore's patients, and I could experiment with potential solutions. If we develop something useful, we could discuss how to make it more widely available. They agreed to pursue the collaboration on an informal basis, with Sarah serving as a liaison between Tom's workshop and the medical practice. The arrangement would give them legitimate reasons to spend time together while pursuing work that could genuinely benefit people in need. As the afternoon sun began to slant lower through the workshop windows, Tom walked Sarah back through the store to the street entrance. The easy conversation and shared enthusiasms of the afternoon had created an atmosphere of comfortable intimacy that neither wanted to break. "Thank you for sharing your workshop with me," Sarah said as they paused at the door. "Your innovations are truly impressive, and I'm excited about the possibility of working together." "The pleasure has been entirely mine," Tom replied. "It's been wonderful to have someone appreciate what I've been trying to accomplish up there. Most people see my workshop as the hobby of a man with too much time on his hands." Sarah looked directly into his eyes, noting the warmth and intelligence she found there. "Then most people are failing to recognize the difference between tinkering and innovation. What you're doing has the potential to change lives." Something shifted in Tom's expression, a deepening of attention that made Sarah acutely aware of the small distance between them. For a moment, she thought he might say something more personal, something that would acknowledge the connection that had been building between them throughout the afternoon. Instead, he stepped back slightly and offered her his most professional smile. "I look forward to hearing from you about potential projects. Please give my regards to Dr. Whitmore." Sarah felt a small stab of disappointment at his retreat into formality, but she recognized the wisdom of proceeding carefully. They were both people who had been wounded by life's unpredictability, and neither could afford to risk their hard-won equilibrium on romantic impulses that might lead nowhere. "Good evening, Mr. Reed," she said, matching his formal tone. "I'll speak with Dr. Whitmore about patients who might benefit from adaptive tools." As she walked home through the quiet Sunday streets of Millbrook, Sarah reflected on the afternoon's revelations. She had discovered not only Tom's remarkable ingenuity and determination, but also a kindred spirit who understood the challenge of rebuilding one's life after devastating loss. Their shared experiences with trauma and recovery had created a foundation of understanding that felt deeper than ordinary friendship, yet neither of them had been ready to acknowledge the romantic potential that hummed beneath their careful conversations. The prospect of their professional collaboration excited her, offering both meaningful work and legitimate reasons to spend time with Tom. But it was the personal connection she had felt in his workshop, the sense of being truly seen and understood by someone who shared her journey from brokenness toward healing, that filled her thoughts as she prepared for bed that evening. For the first time since arriving in Millbrook, Sarah allowed herself to imagine a future that included not just survival and acceptance, but the possibility of love. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying, carrying with it the risk of rejection and heartbreak, but also the promise of companionship and understanding she had never dared to hope for. As she fell asleep that night, Sarah's last conscious thought was of Tom's hands as he worked in his shop, strong and capable despite their singular nature, creating beautiful and useful things from raw materials through skill, patience, and determined hope. Perhaps, she thought drowsily, that was what they were both doing with their lives, taking the broken pieces of their past experiences and fashioning them into something new and valuable, something that could serve not only their own needs, but the needs of others who struggled with similar challenges. The metaphor pleased her, suggesting that their growing connection might be more than mere personal attraction. Perhaps they were meant to work together, to combine their different but complementary skills in service of something larger than either could accomplish alone. The thought followed her into dreams filled with sunlight, streaming through workshop windows and the sound of laughter echoing through spaces designed for creation rather than mere survival. Winter descended upon Millbrook with unusual gentleness that year, as if the mountains themselves were conspiring to create perfect conditions for love to flourish. Sarah and Tom's collaboration had blossomed beyond their wildest expectations, producing a series of adaptive tools that transformed the lives of patients throughout the territory. Word of their innovations spread through the network of Frontier physicians, bringing requests for custom solutions from as far away as Denver and Santa Fe. Their professional partnership had evolved into something far more precious. Tom began appearing at the medical practice with increasing frequency, ostensibly to deliver completed tools or discuss new projects, but lingering for conversations that ranged far beyond business concerns. Sarah found herself inventing reasons to visit the hardware store, her heart racing each time she climbed the stairs to Tom's workshop, where they worked side by side creating solutions that brought dignity and independence back to people who had lost hope. The transformation in Sarah's standing within the community was remarkable. No longer whispered about as the broken woman rejected by William Harrison, she was now spoken of with respect and admiration. The mothers who had once pulled their children away now sought her advice on family health matters. The women who had avoided her gaze now included her naturally in their social gatherings and community planning discussions. But it was Tom's unwavering regard that truly healed the wounds William's rejection had inflicted. In Tom's eyes, Sarah saw herself reflected not as damaged goods, but as a woman of remarkable strength and capability. He valued her intelligence, relied on her judgment, and treated her as an equal partner in all their endeavors. When he looked at her, she didn't see pity or curiosity but genuine appreciation for who she had become through surviving her trials. The moment everything changed came during a fierce February blizzard that trapped them together in Tom's workshop. Sarah had arrived that afternoon to discuss modifications to a feeding device for an elderly rancher, intending to stay only briefly. But the storm intensified rapidly, transforming the world outside into a whirling vortex of snow and wind that made travel impossible. "You can't possibly walk home in this weather," Tom said, peering through windows that showed nothing but white chaos. The storm's supposed to last through the night. Sarah found herself alone with Tom in the intimate space of his workshop, the rest of the world shut out by nature's fury. They shared a simple supper by lamplight, their conversation flowing with the ease of old friends who had discovered they were something more. When Sarah mentioned feeling cold, Tom built up the fire in his small stove and offered her his own coat to wrap around her shoulders. "Tom," Sarah said quietly as they sat watching the flames dance behind the stove's glass door, "may I ask you something personal?" "Of course," he replied, his voice warm in the firelit darkness. "Do you ever wonder what your life might have been like if you hadn't been injured, if you'd returned from the war whole and unmarked?" Tom was silent for a long moment, considering her question with the thoughtfulness she had come to treasure in him. "I used to torture myself with that exact question," he admitted. "But recently, I've begun to think that perhaps my injury wasn't the end of my story, but the beginning of the one I was meant to live." "What do you mean?" Tom turned to face her fully, his expression serious but tender. "If I hadn't lost my arm, I never would have come to Millbrook. I never would have learned to see the world differently, to find new ways of solving problems, to understand what it means to be truly grateful for what remains, rather than bitter about what's lost. And I never would have met you." The words hung between them like a bridge neither had dared to cross before. Sarah felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she recognized the declaration hidden within his careful phrasing. "Tom," she whispered, scarcely able to believe what she was hearing. "Sarah," he said, reaching across the space between them to take her hand in his, "I know I'm not what any woman dreams of when she imagines her future. I'm a damaged soldier with one arm and a modest business in a frontier town. I have no grand estate to offer, no family fortune, no guarantees of an easy life." "Stop," Sarah said firmly, gripping his hand tighter. "Don't you dare diminish yourself that way. You're the most remarkable man I've ever known. Then let me say what I've been trying to work up the courage to tell you for weeks, Tom continued, his voice growing stronger. I love you, Sarah Mitchell. I love your strength, your compassion, your brilliant mind, and your generous heart. I love the way you see possibility where others see only problems. I love that you understand what it means to be broken and choose to keep living anyway. Tears streamed down Sarah's cheeks as she heard words she had never expected to hear from any man, least of all one whose respect and affection meant more to her than all the grand gestures in the world. I love you too, she whispered, the admission feeling like stepping into sunlight after a long winter. I love your courage, your innovation, your kindness to everyone regardless of their circumstances. I love that you see me as I am and find me worthy of your regard. Tom's face lit up with joy as he leaned forward to frame her face with his hand, his thumb gently wiping away her tears. Sarah, he said, his voice rough with emotion, will you marry me? Will you build a life with me here in Millbrook, working together to help people and create something beautiful from the pieces of our past? Yes, Sarah breathed, and then louder, with conviction that rang through the workshop. Yes, Tom Reed, I will marry you. Their wedding took place 3 months later beneath the same blossoming trees where Sarah had once sat alone and despairing, wondering if she would ever find a place to belong. The entire town turned out for the celebration, including William Harrison, who approached Sarah during the reception with genuine humility. Miss Mitchell, he said, hat in hand, I owe you an apology and my gratitude. My rejection was based on fear and prejudice, not wisdom. Seeing you with Tom, seeing what you've built together, I realize I was the one who was broken, not you. Sarah looked at the man who had once made her feel worthless and felt only compassion for his obvious regret. We all carry wounds, Mr. Harrison, she said gently. The question is what we choose to do with them. As Sarah and Tom danced their first dance as husband and wife, surrounded by a community that had come to cherish them both, Sarah marveled at the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had arrived in Millbrook labeled as broken, rejected, and cast out. But in learning to value herself and in finding someone who saw her true worth, she had discovered that being broken was not a permanent condition, but simply a starting point for rebuilding something stronger and more beautiful than what had come before. The woman who had once feared she was too damaged for love now stood in the arms of a man who understood that their scars were not flaws to be hidden, but evidence of battles survived and strength discovered. Together, they had proven that too. Broken people could create something whole, something that served not only their own happiness, but the welfare of everyone whose lives they touched. In the end, Sarah realized she had not been rescued by love, but rather had learned to rescue herself, finding in Tom not a savior, but a partner equally committed to the work of turning brokenness into beauty, isolation into community, and despair into hope. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.